Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Today is Wednesday, Shushan Purim Katan. So if this was not a leap year, today would be Shushan Purim, the 15th of Adar. And we are also the 16th of February. That's not, well, anyways. And we're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently studying Masechet Shabbat, chapter 12, which is a pretty short chapter. So we'll be making another siyum on another perek in short order. And we're talking now about kosev, writing, and the definition of writing, how a person could be over. The Mishnah gives a whole bunch of criteria, varying opinions, and we're going to continue that discussion. Again, what is exactly the definition of the minimum amount of writing to be chayiv? And depending on the purpose and the exact identity of the prohibition of kosev, of writing, may influence the opinion. We quoted a long brisa, which brought varying opinions, and we're going to continue along those lines. Before we start, we're dedicating our learning for all our dear members of the Chabura and their households for good health and happiness. And I want to mention two dear friends, Leah Basrita and Malka Basrivka, for complete and speedy recovery. And again, especially sending good, positive wishes and blessings to the dear people who make this Gemara Chabura happen, either by having your face on the screen, or even if maybe we don't get to see them, but there are those who are always in the background supporting, encouraging, and participating. And so we should certainly give a shout out as well. I'm going to share the screen and we'll get started. And again, today is going to take us to an interesting topic, a topic that always fascinates me. Writing is very interesting because, of course, writing is one of the early and most consequential developments for civilization. The ability to write is the ability to convey information, to preserve information, and it's hard to or it's hard to overstate, I should say, the significance of writing. Certainly for the Jewish people, many times described as the people of the book, Jews have a high value and put great significance to writing. Rabbi. And so, yes, Rabbi.
There's a new element these days that writing does not require a pen and ink, a keyboard.
Yeah. I'll tell you something that I think about, and I think I mentioned it here because I'm interested in archaeology again, probably as much as all of us here. But I follow a few of the blogs and I get some Google notices especially in Israeli archaeology. It's always very interesting, and I always wonder what our footprint, what archaeologists will find out about us. And I think the archaeologists will think we were the most unsophisticated and boring people. Not only did we not have the ability to write, but we have zero written record. And they're going to wonder how we built such wonderful, so we had such wonderful advances without any writing or very limited writing. Because of course, if everything is digital, archaeologists will probably have a hard time activating our machines and our computers and our hard drives into the future. And so, Rebero, on one hand, you're right, we write on a keyboard, but on the other hand, is that writing at all? I don't want to address that now, but we should add it to the short list of writing spin-offs, which is there a difference between kosev, writing with a writing implement or dipping our finger in ink or whatever, and typing on a keyboard, typing on a screen.
Writing on the keyboard is definitely not writing. It's just we are using the term we are used to describe a different activity. Similarly to we say we still are dialing a number on the phone. Although right. It is a totally different activity, it's just the use of the vocabulary for new purposes.
So now let me ask you, Professor, another question. A computer, you're saying, is certainly not writing in the literal sense. Now, what about a typewriter?
Well, that's actually the same thing. It creates an imprint that would be impossible to create with the writing letters, because it's obvious that writing that the Talmud has in mind is a process. typewriting is similar to cleanopis that Babylonians used to use. That might be the analogy, but obviously the Gemara doesn't discuss the Babylonian method of writing.
And Professor,
inks and so on.
And before that, we can ask about using plates that were used in printing as well. It's not literal writing, but it was the representation of words, or the imprinting of words with ink on paper. Or I think what you're referring to, the Babylonians had a stylus that they would put into clay or something. Is that what you were? Right. So I don't want to give the answer now, but it's something that we should keep in mind as we analyze what the essence of writing is according to the different opinions. And it's something interesting to also keep in mind. And of course, these questions are going to be addressed more in contemporary Sheilot Teshuvot, because the development of writing on a computer is only, I don't know, however recent it is. It's not more than I'm going to say more than 100 years old, but probably a good bit less than that. But anyways, okay, let's see the Gemara.
So we're going to have some form of computing in the 50s. You're very primitive. Sorry? They had some form of digital computing, probably maybe even the late 40s, for teletypes.
Right. All right. So again, we're not immediately going to discuss that now, but it was brought up here, and we'll see going forward, as there will be in a day or two more discussion about the definitions of writing. So if you recall, one of the opinions was that you have a shem katan, a small word subsumed in a bigger word. And the shaila was, if you don't write the entire word you intended, but when you stopped in the middle of the word, you've already written two letters and another word has been written. And so Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah says that you could be chayiv, shem katan mishem gadol. And the Mishnah brought all the examples, as you recall. Shem is part of Shimon, Gad, Gadiel, Dan, Daniel, etc. So there are many instances where you could have a smaller word that is included in a bigger word, and even if you didn't do your full intention, a word has been written and you did what you intended to do, which is to write part of a word, and you have a whole word. And that is what Rabbi Yehuda says. The Gemara is now going to challenge that in a very interesting way. I wonder if you've thought of this. We keep on talking about Shem and Shimon. Now look on the screen for a moment. Look at the actual font. Look at the word Shem. Look at the word Shimon. And if we isolate just the word Shimon here, do you see the word Shem here?
It's the final mem versus the regular mem.
So you see the word Shin and Mem, but that's not how you write Shem, because the word Shem, a shorter word, actually has a final Mem. The same thing of like Dan and Daniel. And so the question is it really the same word? Can you say that you've written the word Shem if you stopped in the middle of writing the word Shmuel or Shimon? You would never write Shem with a mem patuach, as we'll call it, with a mem that's not at the end of the word. Rashi, I'm sorry, the Gemara. Mi dami, are these comparable? Can you compare Shem and Shimon? Mem de Shem satum. The mem that goes in the word Shem is written with a, as we say in Yiddish, a shlos mem, or a ender mem, a mem sofit, which is a sealed in box, a sealed in letter. And again, if you're unfamiliar, we could just look at the very text that we're exploring here, and we see that satum, the final letter is a mem, a shlos mem, a mem sofit, versus the mem in the middle, which is an open mem. Oh, what I just do? Yeah, because you see the regular mem has an opening here. The shlos mem, or the ender mem, is sealed. That's the primary difference. There are other differences in the practical font, but in a handwritten form, it's plausible that's the primary distinction. But they're not the same letter, asks the Gemara.
In script, they're really quite different.
In script, they're extremely different. Yeah, but we're not talking about our script. We're talking about ostensibly, and we can hold the thought for a moment, about the conventional Ktav Ashurit, the standard Hebrew font that we use today. Rashi, the individual who intends to write Shem as part of the process of writing Shimon, will employ mem pitucha. He'll use the standard mem. I'm sorry, mem pitucha katuv. He wrote with a regular mem. V'heichi kari limit kayemet. And how can we call this an enduring proper word? It's not really the word Shem. Good question. Simple, a kind of question that we might have even anticipated somebody asking in our shir. It's a good question. So Amar Rav Chisda answers, your question actually teaches us something important. Zoi Soimeres, this seems to communicate to us that Satum ve'asa'u patuach, a word that should be written with a final mem, but instead you wrote with a regular mem. Kosher is kosher. In what context? Presumably in writing works of, in Hebrew that have halachic parameters. It would seem to indicate that if you wrote one of these letters in Hebrew, it would be kosher. But that's not, as we're going to see in a moment, that's not true. But from here, maybe we would infer that you can actually write the wrong mem in let's say in a Torah, or let's say in a mezuzah. Instead of writing a final mem, let's think of a word in the Shema.
Well, I'll give you a practical.
Hadvarim. V'hayu hadvarim. What happens if in the end of the word dvarim, you, instead of writing a final mem, you write a regular mem? Doctor, you were going to suggest something?
Yeah, I was going to say a practical issue is when you write in Hebrew, when you do puzzles, word puzzle. So
right.
When you don't write the mem sofit, you write a regular mem because on the it may come in the middle of a word in a word puzzle.
And this is important for Wordle, right? Are we familiar with Wordle?
I don't do that. I'm aware of it, but I haven't got to that one yet. I'm still
okay.
The rabbi's up to date. Isn't the Wordle already the Yiddish one or the English one?
Well,
I was only shown the English one.
I don't know where it happened, but a woman was saved. Her daughter realized, an 84-year-old woman solved a Wordle every day and sent the information to her daughter. One day the daughter didn't get it, so she called the police. And it turned out that a burglar came into her home and locked her up and was still in the home, and they got him and saved the woman.
Wow. You see, it's a mitzvah to play Wordle because, no. Pikuach nefesh. I was waiting for someone to. So I think what Rav Chisda is saying here is not that you, and again, this is going to be challenged, but at this point, I think what he's saying is not that you should incorrectly use the mem, but if a Torah is written in that manner, the Torah would yet be kosher, which is a little surprising.
Rabbi, the other factor is anybody who reads would be able to know that that's what was written, even though it's the wrong mem. Right away, he'd know he's writing Shem. He just didn't write the right letter.
Right. So interestingly enough, I just looked in Rabbi Akiva Eger for a moment, and I hope I'm getting it right. I just glanced through it. I think what he's saying is that Rav Chisda may actually hold this way. We're going to see another brisa that disagrees, but with the power of Rabbi Yehuda's assertion in the Mishnah, perhaps there are those that had the opinion. Again, I don't think halacha l'maisa this is so. There's an opinion that indeed it would be kosher. Now, l'masa, it's interesting because maybe I would get, if you were asking me my opinion, I would just say, hey, there's a distinction between writing a Sefer Torah and writing, a hand scribbled note. A hand scribbled note, if you misspell it, the person who's reading the note knows what you intended, and so it's kosher in that it conveys what Siva is intended to convey, whatever the message is. Whereas in Stam, that it's a different standard, but that's not what he says. Rashba points out what I said. Similarly, you might have also a word, let's say like Dan and Daniel, same issue. Anyways, all right, we'll continue. Interesting question. And this is going to introduce us to a very interesting brisa, which is going to trigger a series of interesting Agadic conversations. Let's take this slowly. Meisvei, there's a problem, a challenge to the assertion that you could miswrite a mem in your holy works and they'll be kosher. It says, Uchsavtam. Right? We know this. Anyone recognize the word Uchsavtam? So it says Uchsavtam. Al mezuzot beisecha u'visharecha, about writing mezuzahs. This is a famous work known as the Shema Yisrael work. And in it, we talk about the importance of having a relationship with Hashem, the study of Torah, teaching children, constantly studying Torah, tefillin and mezuzah. And we talk about in the context of, well, for a reason which maybe we'll discuss soon, Uchsavtam, which is talking about writing the mezuzahs, is related to also the tefillin. So Rashi tells us Uchsavtam, the tefillin and mezuzah. The Torah says Uchsavtam regarding writing tefillin and mezuzahs, and the Brisa tells us this teaches us something important. Shetehei kesiva tama. Writing should be whole, perfect, precise. Look, uchsav tam. So although it means you shall write them, the Brisa says we have a limud here that says uchsav tam. You should write it perfectly. You should write it in the precise way. Rashi, tam shalem kehilchata, with perfect precision following the halachic instructions. Now, what kind of writing would be imperfect? So this Brisa is gracious and gives us a whole bunch of interesting examples, which I think you'll find this text interesting for a number of reasons. So let's take a look. Number one, shelo yechtov alfin ainin. Do not swap your alifs with your ayins. Why would you swap an aleph and an ayin? Anybody?
They sound alike.
Oh, aleph and ayin sound alike. For us Ashkenazic Jews or modern Israeli Jews, modern Hebrew, aleph and ayin are essentially the same sound. So much so that indeed it is plausible and possible even for educated people to occasionally mix up, unless you really know the language in its written and spoken form. But a person who knows Hebrew first as a spoken language and only later on as a written language, it is plausible that we would make an occasional mistake. Now, what's interesting about this to me is that ask a Yemenite Jew if aleph and ayin have the exact sound. And hopefully you have some distance between you and that person, because you may experience their wrath, or certainly certain Sephardic Jews who are very medayek. And I'm not saying this to be critical of them. On the contrary, it is a compliment. But certain Sephardic Jews have a well-preserved Mesorah about a distinction in the pronunciation of ayin and aleph. And so to me, it is interesting that the Gemara is going to assert that aleph and ayin might be interchangeable. Now, doctor, let me show you Rashi, who takes your exact opinion. Alfin ainin, yeshikotvin kain. Occasionally, a person could make this mistake. Mipnei shedomin bekriyatan, because when you read it, their sounds are identical. Would you suppose everybody is going to agree and embrace this interpretation? Is everyone going to agree that aleph and ayin are interchangeable?
No.
No. So the Ramban, now I'm only saying this lachadudi, I'm only saying this only in a partially serious way, but the Ramban and others who are from the Sephardic world. So are you surprised that they might reject this? Pirish Rashi zal mipnei shedomim b'kriyosam. B'acher Pirish, we got to bring another opinion, which is brought in other Rishonim. Shehem domin b'chtivatan. In their written form, they can be confused. How so? Lefi shagufa aleph shukav ha'emsa'i, the central line of the aleph, if you will. Sarich likatfo kafuf kigon zeh. Unfortunately, in our text, we don't have the image the way the Rashba drew it or the way he's quoting, but we need to have the aleph on a slant. If you extend or you extend it the wrong way, Rashi is saying that maybe if you incorrectly write the ayin, it could look like an inverted aleph. Take an aleph, chop off the bottom leg and invert it. And it's not all that different than an ayin. As you know, and I have children that are in varying degrees of learning how to read and write, well, how to write. And children, apparently, in the initial stage of learning how to write, they invert. It's common that they might invert the letters. That's why when you want to mimic a child's writing, you'll make an S backwards, right? Or other letters that are confusing. And the same thing in Hebrew. You might find a child initially making a bays opposite, and maybe even an aleph. And so it's a little bit of a stretch, at least to the way I visualize it. But the Ramban is quoting an opinion that says that it is plausible that in appearance, they could be confusing.
Rabbi, you could say that almost about any letter. You don't make a
Why?
resh, you make a resh not properly, it looks like a dalet. You make
yes.
a yud too long.
The Gemara
Yes.
says
The
that
Bryce
later
is
on.
about to say that. I just wanted to stop here with the aleph and the ayin because I thought that was the most thought-provoking, in that not everybody would agree that an aleph and an ayin sound identical, but Rashi and Dr. Hammer take a strong position that they do. The Ramban and the Rashba and others disagree. And again, it may be partially, I don't want to say cultural, but regional, and different places have a different misora. We might actually draw a distinction between the aleph and the ayin.
What are you looking for?
Let's continue. Let's see. Shalichtav alfin einen alfin. Okay. What about bays? Rebberal tells us basin, coffin, basin. Be extremely careful not to mix up the somewhat similar bays and chaf. A bays and chaf, the only difference between a bays and a chaf is a little extra protrusion on the bays, which we all understand are very closely in appearance. They're very similar. Rashi, doimin b'chsiv asan. See, so Rashi distinguishes aleph and ayin look very different. So he says that they sound alike. Obviously, it's a better shot to say they sound alike because it's a stretch to compare the aleph and the ayin. But the bays and the chaf, that works out well. Sadin, gimelin, gimel, and sadik have a similarity in their appearance. Now, it's only a little bit of a stretch. I want to zoom in. Let's take a look at a tzaddik. Let's see if I can do this. Right. I'll put it back in a moment. Just bear with me if I can figure this out. Now I don't know where my bar is to drag it to the Hebrew. So I might have to. All right, join me for a moment. I hope you don't mind. I want to take a little more time just because this is interesting to understand, at least to me. Look at your tzadi. Look at a gimel and look at a tzaddik. So a gimel has two legs on the bottom and it's flat on top. Now, proportionally with this font, it's much more narrow, but forget that for a moment. Look at the tzaddik. Tzaddik has the two legs on top and it's flat on the bottom. And so with a little bit of creativity, and assuming we're talking about a handwritten font that has more variation, one could imagine a beginner mixing up the form of the tzaddik and the gimel. This is what Rashi says. Doimin, biksi vasan, they're pretty similar. Ella, shezelamala, vezelamata. The features are inverted. The tzaddik has the two prongs on top, and the gimel has the two prongs on bottom. I would have never thought of this on my own, but now that Rashi explains it, I can see it. I want to show you something else. How do we say tzaddik? We say tzaddik. Maybe because tzaddik kuf. So maybe we say tzadi. Reb Menachem, in your childhood, you were taught to say tzadi or tzaddik?
Both.
What does that mean?
Tzaddik was the regular way, but if you wanted to be a little more sophisticated, you said tzaddik. But mostly it was tzaddik.
Okay, very interesting. And how do you say gimel?
Gimel.
Gimel. So it's very interesting to see the Gemara use the word gamin, which sounds like, right, alpha, beta, gamma. But it's, again, it's interesting to see it called a gami or gamin instead of a gimel. Present, doctor, you're muted. Doctor, you're saying something?
Yeah, I said we never used a nun sufit in the end of tzaddik.
The nun at the end is more of an Aramaic
That's
thing,
the
right?
Aramaic. Yes.
Right. So I'm not perturbed by the nun per se. It's just interesting that where did the gimel go? Gimel, gamin. No major scandal, just interesting to point out. Dalsin Ration. So now Rebero, this also, I think you alluded to. A Dalit and a Reish, we again can feel comfortable imagining how the mix-up. It's so obvious that Rashi doesn't even comment. Reish and Dalsin. Heihin Chesen. Heys and Cheses. Chesen Heihin. By the way, in Yiddish, you will say a Heihin Chesen. So this is a somewhat this is something that I guess is incorporated into Yiddish. Hey and chesen, chesen, hey and chesen, hey also are pretty similar. Okay, the hey has a little floating leg, but let me see. Hold on, give me 1 second. Dead Sea font. Let's see. Dead Sea Aleph Bet font. Let's see if we can find the chart for the Dead Sea. Okay, this is an excerpt from the Dead Sea. Aleph Beis Gimel Daled Hey. Okay, I don't know if this is not a scientific, but here, let's just open this up. Here are the Aleph Beis based on that era's writing. Aleph Beis Gimel Daled Hey. Vav, Zayin, Ches. Right, there's a reason why you need to be somewhat of an expert to decipher the Dead Sea script. Again, not all the scrolls are this way. This is just a search. There are varying handwritings and some very wide variation in the script. But look at the Ches here and look at the Hey here. Here, the Hey does not even have a floating leg. And the only difference is here, the protrusion extends out from under what to us looks like a ches, and here it's written, So with this handwritten script, could you imagine mixing up the two? I think it's closer. Today you say, oh, you just look for the floating leg, and not. Other fonts.
Well, look at the similarity between the Aleph and the Chet.
Right. But I didn't point that out because the Gemara doesn't say, hey, you might mix up the Aleph and the Ches. Now let's see, Gimel and Sadi.
Even the Aleph and the Hey.
See, there any other instances that we can look at just for interesting? Anyways, all right, so there we see it. Hayin, Chasen, Hayin, Vavin, Yudin, a Vav and a Yud. Even to this day, Sofrim, or the folks that check Tefillin and Mezuzahs, occasionally will stop and say, hey, does this yud look like it's so long that it might interfere with the kashrus of the tefillin or mezuzah or the sefer Torah or vice versa? Because a vav and a yud, lemaisa, they're different in the script of a sofer. But if you stretch the yud too much or you shrink the vav too much, it could be problematic because they can be interchanged. Vav and yud and vavin, zayin nonin, a zayin and a nun, not a nun sofit, but a zayin and a nun, I guess, could look similar enough. I shouldn't have closed that chart so fast. Mem nun. Okay, I don't see it in the Dead Sea font.
Rabbi,
Yes.
and those Dead Sea Scrolls, weren't they written by a sect of Jews who went off the track?
So that's a complicated question. They were certainly collected by a sect that, according to most historians, and I like Professor, I was in Lawrence, Hirschman, now I'm mixing up. So, and many others, pretty much a consensus that it was a group of folks, whether you want to call them Messians or Professor, he calls them, I'm sorry, Lawrence Schiffman, he calls them the conventional terminology, we call them Essenes, but he has a theory that they were a spin-off of the Sadducees. But however you want to understand it, they were not typical, and it's hard. I know experts in the field will tell me you can't call any Jew typical of the Second Temple era because there are so many different groups. But the reality is they weren't conventional Sadducees, they weren't conventional Pharisees. They were an interesting sect. And I see recently their articles re-examining and reconsidering the identity of but the bottom line is, even though they were owned by a variant, off a group that wasn't part of what we might describe as the mainstream, it's not certain that they wrote and authored all the works in Qumran. It looks like they collected works from all over. So at the very least, we could look at their script to give us some kind of insight into a Brisa or Mishnah. But again, it's not necessarily the end all, but it's good for insight. Suffice it to say, what I did learn from this here is that the Zayins here are not like what we look at as Zayin. The Zayins do have a nun. Look at that letter. Again, I closed. Look at that nun. Look at that Zayin. Certainly nothing like our contemporary Zayin. I could see that being a nun. So maybe the sages of the Mishnah didn't have such a pronounced leg of the nun. Maybe it was more curved like our font. And then I could see how you would mix up a Zayin and a nun. Again, this is not a typical yeshivish way of learning the Gemara, but I think it's interesting and worth our exploration. Zayin and nun and nun. Zayin, Tessin and Pei-fin. Tesses and Pays. Again, Pei-fin. But anyways, that's a Pei. A Tess and a Pei. Also, let's look at the form of the Tess and the Fei. In this font, we're less likely to mix them up. But in a more rudimentary font, could you imagine if we would shave off the leg of the Tess? Well, then maybe it looks like a Pei. Let's be a little creative. Let's look here again. Let's see if there's any insight here. Pei, Tess. Could you imagine we just dropped that leg? You think this is a Pei? So anyways, close enough, and certainly in those days it was close enough. So these are a bunch of letters that are reasonably interchanged, either because of their appearance or other factors. Just see. Very interesting. Let me just show you this fast Tosfos. Tosfos says, and I should have given you another introduction. I'll give you after this Tosfos. Tessin Pein. Mikan Nir Rabbeinu Tam. Based on this Gemara, he had an opinion that Sarich Lokuf Roish Hates Letoichai. The test needs to have a slight curvature, I believe, of the right head to look more like a Pei. So the Rabbeinu Tam says this is a clue about how to design, how to halachically to design the tests to have a pay appearance. So I should add like this, if I'm not mistaken, and this is not my specialty, and I haven't given a lot of research into this, but one of the very complicated matters of halacha are the design of the aleph base. As a matter of fact, although they're all pretty similar, today there are 4 prevalent fonts for writing stam, for writing Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzot. There's the conventional Sephardic Ksav. There is the Arizal Ksav. There's the Beit Yosef Ksav, which is the conventional Ashkenazic Ksav. And then there was a distinct variation of the Arizal Ksav that was taught by the Baal HaTanya, and some people still have the Baal HaTanya's Ksav. But interestingly enough,
what if someone decides to write, let's say, a mezuzah in Ktav Rashi?
So I don't think that qualifies, because there are many, many specific halachic criteria of what makes a letter kosher halachically today. But what I wanted to say is that there is not in the Chumash or in Tanakh or in the Gemara an exhaustive record of how, and a list of all the criteria of the letters and what makes them kosher. There is not. What we have instead, like other areas of Jewish tradition, there's a Mesorah. There's a tradition. And in order to be a certified sofer, you have to have Kabbalah. You have to be taught from another scribe. And likely, as a matter of fact, much of the fundamental kosher status of a letter is fairly simple, but there's a lot of flair, nuance, and style that different sofrim have developed or had a tradition. And but because it's not explicitly in the Gemara, there's a lot of discussion and debate, and in some of the greatest, I don't want to say wars, but some of the greatest halachic vigorous dialogue is about the appropriate kitav and the font of stam of Sefer Torah Mezuzot. And so it's not surprising that Rabbeinu Tam would be excited and use this Gemara to inform a nuance on how to form a test, because there isn't a lot in the Gemara that informs the shapes of the letters.
Rabbi,
let me just add one more thing. The Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef, and from then on, there's a lot of discussion in our works about the criteria for letters. So I don't want to make it sound like there are no written works, but in the Gemara we don't have a lot. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Alan.
I know a couple of Satmirs, when they get up, they say Yahai Shmai Rabbah. Is it written the same as we write it?
Yes, it's the variation in pronunciation is not because of different letters. It's literally an accent, and there are varying Hebrew accents of how to appropriately recite Hebrew in prayer. And so, if you come from Hungary, you have a certain accent, and if you come from Poland or Galicia, and if you came from Lithuania and Russia, you had another accent. And it's the differences in Hebrew. It's also in their, if you spoke Yiddish, it's also in their Yiddish. So I think, Dr. Hammer, when you were introduced to many of the survivors, they were Litvaks. And so they had a...
Excuse me.
I'm saying most of the survivors were Galiciana, but you had, didn't you have students that were from the Mir that came from Shanghai?
Yeah. No, I have a...
So their Yiddish and their... Their accent would have been very Litvish. But the average person on the street, you're right, would have had a Galiciana accent. Right. And in a way, it's kind of sad that a lot of that prayer, besides for in the Hasidic world, has kind of been forgotten, because it has a very, even I'll tell you this much, when I grew up here in Florida, so the Chazanim were all, or for the most part, were survivors. And so we would hear, I don't want to use the word authentic, but we would hear a good traditional Galicianer, or Polish or Hungarian davening, and although it was not the reading, the way of pronunciation that I was introduced to at home or in school, there's something to me very familiar and beautiful to hear that kind of tefillah. And today you can only hear it more or less if you go into a Hasidic Stiebel, you can still hear those different
So at home, my father was a Galicianer, so Friday night, Zmiris was with a Galicianer accent in Israel, and it's really my sister and I. It was sounded totally, and we sang it totally different. I mean, we sometimes reproduce it singing together, but it sounds so different, and so I may be special, but yeah.
Rabbi,
I remember very fondly our Galiciana Gabbai, Mr. Peter.
Yes. I'll tell you even more than that. He would daven almost every single Shabbos, Psukei de Zimra. Not because he wanted to be the chazan, but he would look at the clock, look around, and if no one would go up, he'd shrug his shoulders. Every week it was like a routine. He'd look around, he'd shrug his shoulders and defeat, and walk up and do Psukei de Zimra. And
it was an hour and a half of Psukei de Zimra.
It wasn't the fastest Psukei de Zimra. But there are actually certain words in Psukei de Zimra that I will occasionally mispronounce because I knew them from hearing them before I could even read them. Anyways, so
Rabbi,
it
gets even more complicated in written Yiddish. It's hard to have a standardized spelling because he'd write it one way, you say Mistamaz Poilisher. So instead of an aleph, two Yud.
Even more than that, there's evidence that the accent of Yiddish itself evolved over the 300, 400, 500 years that we have written Yiddish, because Yiddish was first a spoken language before a written language. And so a lot of times, if you look at written Yiddish, you can kind of get a sense, maybe not anymore, you can get a sense of how it was pronounced. And so a lot of the old Litvish and in Chabad, there were certain words. For example, Lithuanians are famous for the interchanging or maybe doing a pronounced sin instead of a shin. And other such, and you can tell in the writings initially, you can kind of see that those accents presented in the writings and other nuances. So,
Rabbi, I have a tchina in Yiddish from my grandmother that has nikudot, Yiddish with nikudot, to be sure of the pronunciation.
But you realize the nikudas don't help you, because if you're a Galiciana, you pronounce the
doesn't matter what they say.
You pronounce the chirik differently, and you pronounce the tzere differently. Anyways, all right. So we're in the middle of a brisa. We took almost the whole day to talk about a brisa. But anyways, the brisa says you got to get things right. Don't mix. There are the famous interchangeable letters. Get it straight. Don't mix them up. But we're not done yet. Similarly, kifufin, pshutin. Certain letters. For example, certain letters had variations of how they were written, depending on. Well, no, here Rashi says simple: Chaf, Pei, Tzadik, and Nun. These are all letters that have sofit, right? Letters. So don't mix up. Don't write a Nun that's kafuf, that's bent, as pashut. The lange Nun, the Nun sofit is long. The Nun in the middle of the word is bent. Chaf as well, right? Chaf goes down. If it's bent, it's the chaf in the middle of the word. So don't bend the ones that are supposed to be straight. Don't make straight the ones that are supposed to be bent. Also, meimin, samachin. Don't mix up the mem and the samach. Samachin, memin. Don't mix up the samach, or the vice versa. Rashi. Mem situma, doima l'samach. A mem sofit and a samach are very similar. I see here they don't even give us a mem sofit. Okay.
At the bottom. Down at the bottom, they have the final letters.
Oh, you're right. So Sadik.
Their mem sofit is very strange.
Hold on, help me over here. This must be a la'achaf.
Yeah, chaf. Yeah, it could be.
Or is that a mem? See, I don't even know.
Yeah, because it's square.
Is that a chaf? Is that a tzadik? Is that a nun?
I think the first one's a pei sofit. The second one would
I'm
be
sorry. No. This is a nun. Okay. This is probably a nun.
No, that's probably the chaf. That's the chaf. The first one's the pei sofit.
So why is it scrambled then?
I don't know why it's crowned, but from the shapes of the letters, it's the only
This
thing
looks
that
like a
makes sense.
tzaddik, right? This looks like a nun, but then what's this?
And that looks like the more like, remember the nun was more,
So you're
That's probably
saying
the-
we're
second
so you're
one's the
saying this?
chaf, right? Wouldn't that be the chaf?
I don't know. I don't know in this font. I'll tell you, I haven't, it's bothered me, but I haven't really mastered. So for example, for me, if I see a Dead Sea Scroll,
No, it's
depending if
going
it's
the other way for some reason. That doesn't make sense why it's going the other way.
man
got-
spachre, mem, nun, tzaddik.
But it still doesn't make sense, yeah. No,
All right. Anyways,
we'll never figure it out.
we'll figure it out, but just not this moment. Stumim, psuchim, psuchin, stumin. Don't mix up a samach and a mem, a shlas mem, a mem sofit. Also, stumin, psuchin, don't mix up the closed mem with the open mem, and psuchin, stumin, or the open mem and the closed mem. So the Brisa continues with the same, a similar instruction to avoid mixing up the similar letters. In addition to that, parsha psucha lo yasen estuma. As we know in the Torah, sometimes a parsha, between different segments in the Torah, there is a space. Sometimes the space is just a few words, and then you start the next paragraph, and sometimes you go to the next line. Stuma psucha, psucha stuma. So don't mix that up. Kosva keshira. If you wrote the Torah in an inappropriate, incorrect way in this format of a shira, as you know, you can tell in the Torah. Let's see if we can get a picture of this. As ya shir in the Torah. Let's see if they'll give us a picture. Here.
Yeah.
Actually, hold on. This picture is better. Here we go. Here's the Torah. This is Parshas Mishalach. And so if you look carefully, I know it's not, you can't see each word. You see here is like a standard text of the Torah. You see this? The line ends.
Yeah.
And it goes to the next line. Let's go to the third column for a moment. You see here, Ani Hashem Rokefecha. There's a space, and the next paragraph starts. Doesn't go all the way to the next line. It starts in the middle. That's a stuma versus a psucha. But now look in the middle. Az Yashir. There's a special format for writing songs. It's a special division. There's a similar format for the song Parshas Hazinu. So there's a song format. And so we're being told here, don't mix up the format that's formatted for a shira with a format that is not supposed to be so. Or if a person writes with the wrong ink. Diyoi is black ink, halachically sanctioned ink. You can't write it with another kind of pigment or another kind of color. Apparently, there were those who would want to write Hashem's name in gold. You can't do that. The Torah cannot be written in any other color besides for black. Gold, although it was fancy, and maybe some people wanted to do it as a hiddur, to beautify the Torah, that's not allowed. The problem is even more than that. You're not allowed to erase Hashem's name. So if you write a word in a wrong way, you could just delete it or erase it. But if you write Hashem's name, what do? Hare elu yignazu. They need to go into shemis, into geniza. So we have over here is a pretty exhaustive list of all the potential common mistakes a person might make in the creation of a Torah or mezuzah or tefillin. The bottom line of all this is you're not allowed to mix up a mem and a shlas mem. You're not allowed to exchange a mem sofit, the mem that belongs at the end of the word, with the mem in the middle of the word. And if that's the case, we are rejecting or challenging the opinion of Rav Chisda, who says, Zoy Seimeres, that you're allowed to mix up the mems. And if that's the case, we have a problem. How do you have shame? Me shimoin. How do you have the word shame? In shimoin, it's not the same word. My friends, I want to thank you for your indulgence as we spent a little more time than usual on each word. I found it interesting. I hope you'll agree. And with Hashem's help, tomorrow we'll continue with some esoteric messages that can be gleaned from the names of the Aleph Beis and the design of the Aleph Beis. So more and more interesting and kind of a little different than what we've been talking about until now. Rebbe, go ahead.
Rabbi, you may have a subject for a sermon. It's interesting in comparing the Hebrew alphabet to the English that they have capital letters and we change the final letter.
Interesting. And we also have the kudot, whereas in English, vowels are within the words and other distinctions. But I like what you're saying. You're saying we capitalize at the beginning. All right, we'll have to develop this, but something we can talk about.
Maybe the others, the suffixgit.
I don't want to get political. Okay, but we also move from the right to the left in Hebrew and from the left to the right in English.
So you know that a person that is inclined to the right will say, you see, you got to start with the right. The other person that's inclined to the left says, no, look at the direction we're taking. So you can't win this one.
Right.
Okay, 2 sermons.
All right, dear friends, thank you all for joining us today. Went a little over time. As soon as we end this link, please rejoin to study today's daily Chumash. And looking forward to seeing everybody tomorrow with Hashem's help, Gesundheit and Freiliche. Thank you all so very much.